Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I hope you found it safely through the autumnal darkness. It's a very beautiful setting, but rather sort of Sherlock Holmes-esque in its at this time of year. Anyway, my name is Simon Taylor. I'm the news editor of European Voice. I'd like very much to welcome you and thank you for coming for this, the latest event in the Comment Vision series in association with Shell. Those of you, and I recognise a few faces, have been to our events before, will know it's a series of events on a regular basis where we look at different aspects of EU and international energy policy. We have, I think, a slightly different topic from recent ones, but nonetheless very interesting one. This evening's event is called Towards More Transparency, Shining a Light on Extractive Industries. It's very much focused on the recent European Commission proposal for a revision of the Transparency Directive, which will require companies to make disclosure about their dealings with governments, their revenues from resource extraction. It's an initiative that takes place, as you are no doubt aware, in the context of similar moves in the US, but also existing initiatives, the Transparency Initiative, which has been going for, I think, about 10 years, but we have Simon Taylor from Global Witness who will be able to give us an expert overview. To just talk you through, give you an idea of the proceedings this evening before I introduce the speakers, we're going to allow each of the speakers 5 to 7 minutes by way of introduction to talk about their area of expertise. And then we will have an exchange of views and a debate in which you're very, very much invited and expected, indeed, to take part. We have half an hour for the initial presentations and an hour for the debate. And then at the end of the evening, we'll have conclusions by Andrew Vickers from Shell. And almost the most important part of the evening, we also have a networking reception afterwards. So that will be an extra incentive, if any were needed, to ensure that as many of you possible stay to the end. But I hope you won't have anything that will drag you away. I quickly introduce the speakers to you, and then I will invite them to take their microphones and make their brief presentations. In the order of speaking, we have Claire Berry, who's an acting director in the European Commission's Directorate General for the Internal Market, responsible for capital and companies. We have Simon Taylor, my namesake, unfortunately, and to his shame, founding director of Global Witness. We have Reinhard Bütikofer, a German Green MEP who was the rapporteur on the raw materials strategy for the European Parliament, a very eminent Green politician. And Vicky Bowman, Global Practice Leader for External Affairs at Rio Tinto, and someone I previously dealt with when she was the spokesman for the UK Permanent Representation, and I was a slightly less, a more humble journalist than maybe I am today. Anyway, it's a very high-quality lineup of people. I think we're going to have a very informative session about the different initiatives and their pros and cons. And so on that note, I'd like to invite Claire Berry to make some introductory remarks. Claire.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon, and thanks for inviting me along this evening. You've asked that I just say a few words about what's actually in the Commission proposal. So maybe to just give you a little bit of background, the story started about a year ago when the European Parliament, when it was looking at a revision of the Transparency Directive, asked the Commission to look into this question. It's taken us a year. Why? Because we had a public consultation. We took views from the stakeholders. And of course, we had to write one of our famous impact assessments, where we had to try and weigh the costs and benefits of the proposal. So what did we come up with? How balanced is it, and what does it actually contain? So the proposal actually modifies two actually 3 pieces of legislation, and it will require the disclosure of payments to governments on a country and also on a project basis by listed and large unlisted companies with activities in the extractive area, so that's oil, gas, mining, and also in the forestry sector. Where the payments are, and I use these words very carefully because I'm quoting from what's in there, material to the recipient government. So the reporting format in terms of the content of what needs to be reported is very much based on the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI, which I guess most of you here are already familiar with. So it includes payments such as royalties, bonuses, license fees, and profit taxes. Where there is a group of companies in line with what we normally do, the requirement is for the parent company to prepare the report. So not the subsidiary, but the parent company. And through this transparency, Commissioner Barnier very much hopes it's not like a normal accounting proposal, I would say. This one goes further and has slightly different objectives, that we will address some issues around government accountability and bring about better governance. Why have we targeted listed and unlisted companies? Because in the consultation that we did and the preparatory work, it was clear that we needed to have a level playing field between unlisted and listed companies. Of course, in doing this, we have gone further than the Americans have done in Dodd-Frank, although I think the jury's very much out still in the US in terms of what the actual form of the legislation is going to be. I understand from indeed comments that Simon was making just before we started that things are moving now from the SEC's point of view, but we're watching very carefully what goes on in there. In fact, one of our staff members who worked on this proposal is actually there at the moment. So what was the challenge that we faced in terms of preparing the proposal and how to balance the different interests? Of course, we wanted as much transparency as possible, but of course, we were very much conscious, very regularly reminded of the burden that there could be for companies in this process. The state of the European economy means that this is also preoccupation which is very high in the minds of politicians at the moment too. So we try to strike this balance by having materiality criteria. Of course, you're going to ask me later on what exactly is that going to mean in practice. We haven't said a lot around materiality in the proposal. There are some ideas in the impact assessment, but I think that's something very much that now needs to be debated now that the proposal is on the table. But that materiality criteria is in relation to the recipient government, not to do with the company making the payment. A serious concern that was expressed when the proposal was being discussed was what to do about disclosure where that disclosure is prohibited in a third country, in the local country where the company is working. So for the purposes of the proposal, the compromise that was found on this was to limit the exemption to protecting employees working for companies in countries where it would be a crime to disclose payment information. Now, the bar is set quite high in relation to what this means. What does it mean it's a crime? And there has to be disclosure around why the country has made it a crime and why they think the disclosure could be problematic. Now, I know this is going to be controversial. I'm sure we'll have quite some discussions around that. Of course, industry was very concerned. This project started off as being called country-by-country reporting and became country and project reporting part way through the process. Industry expressed a lot of concerns about the level of granularity that they would need to give about particular projects. Again, I'm sure there's going to be discussion around this because I know that there are NGOs who think that we should have gone further. We shouldn't just have talked about projects in the way that we've defined them. We should have talked about leases, licenses, and concessions, going further down in terms of the chain. But this was one of the areas where we tried to strike a balance. We think this is a relatively ambitious proposal. Of course, the Parliament and others will tell us whether we've managed that or not. Of course, we don't do this alone in the EU. The international context is very relevant. I've already mentioned what was happening in the US, which was clearly a very strong catalyst to what has happened within the EU, but also the Commission has raised the issue with the International Accounting Standards Board, which is the global standard setter on accounting standards, urged them to do further work on this so that we can try and actually have a global level playing field. But the response from the IASB was that it would take some time to do this. So Commissioner Barnier's decision, especially in the light of what the Parliament had said to him about the importance of this proposal, was that we shouldn't wait, but that we should go ahead with the proposal. How quickly will things go now? It's taken a year to produce. The indications we have so far from the incoming Danish presidency, obviously at the moment we still have the polls in the chair, but most of the work I think is going to be done on the Danish presidency, that they will treat this as a priority. Obviously there are other issues in the proposals that will need to be resolved as well, more technical accounting issues, but the Danes have given us very firm assurances this is going to priority. Scheduled several meetings already, and I know from the Parliament's point of view that rapporteurs are in the process of being nominated. So from the Commission's point of view, we're hoping the work is going to go quickly. And we will, of course, continue. I mentioned already we have colleagues talking to the SEC, what's happening in the US. We will continue to work on the international front as well to try and get progress on this issue. This has been a top priority for Michel Barnier since he arrived in the Commission, and I'm sure it's going to stay up there for him in terms of making progress.
Thank you very much, Claire. Our next speaker is Simon Taylor, who's founding director of Global Witness, which is an NGO that campaigns specifically on natural resources issues. Simon.
I'm going to start with an image, if I can make it work.
Is the volume okay in the room? It's not.
Can you hear?
Great here up on the stage, but it's as long as. Okay.
No, wrong one. Hang on a sec. Sorry, I want to go. Okay. Are we at the beginning? Okay. You might be wondering what that's doing there. Apart from having the dubious distinction of being, I think, the most expensive production car in the world, it's also owned by one Théodorin Obiang, the son of this man in the centre, the rather unpleasant, shall we say, president for life of Equatorial Guinea. But I could be talking about other places as well. For example, here's the late Turkmenbashi in his golden effigy revolving around, to face the sun. Turkmenbashi, you might recall, as president of Turkmenistan, was in control of much of Europe's gas supplies, and yet we had no idea where the money that was derived from selling these exports to Europe went. And in fact, some of it ended up in large bank accounts in Frankfurt at his personal pleasure. Or perhaps Obiang's friend down the coast, President Dos Santos, probably he and his clique of fellow leaders make up probably one of the most kleptocratic regimes in Africa today. I think they would, by any account of the investigations we've conducted, make Sani Abacha look like a Sunday school picnic when it comes to sort of unaccountable revenue streams. This is what it's like, though, if you're a normal person living in Equatorial Guinea, which, by the way, has a per capita income now equivalent to Denmark, and yet 70% of the population live on $1 a day or less. And this is one of the reasons why. This is the son of the president who owned the motor car I showed you earlier. This is his house in Malibu, which was subject to a seizure order by the US Department of Justice a few weeks ago, along with his $38 million jet stream and 24 vehicles which were exported to France, I think somewhere halfway through last year. And there's a pleasant story at the end of this, which I'll come to in a second. But I think this quite nicely illustrates one of the investigations we conducted into this person earlier in the year, uncovered the blueprints of a yacht. Think of James Bond-style villain yacht. You know, the really bad taste type that splits in half and the baddie escapes? Well, he was going to have one built, and he spent 300,000 euros on a plan, which isn't just a sketch. I think this was quite serious. For a yacht which would have come to $380 million, we're talking 10 times the combined healthcare and education budget for the whole country. He didn't build it in the end. He said it was just a sketch and he wasn't serious. we think it might have had something to do with the exposure. Anyway, back to vehicles again. This is the funny story, the sideline. What happened after his vehicles were exported to France to escape increasing attention in the United States was that, subject to a case filed in Paris, the French police seized some of his cars, and here they are being taken away. Now, jokes aside, there's a serious point I'm trying to make here. I wanted to illustrate why we're doing this. This is not just an issue of accounting. This is about real lives, real people. This is about stealing people's future. This is about asset stripping entire states. And where people like you and me, sitting in their country, have no right to know anything at all. I can sit here and Google and find out what, for example, BP or Shell pays to my government. I can do the same for Exxon, but try that in Angola, where people remain at the bottom of the Human Development Index. It is a non-starter. There is no information available. So this was the origin of this work. And the reason I mention this also is that this forms, I think, another parallel piece of work that's going on at the same time. So the work we're talking about here, transparency over the revenue streams, is but one part of a wider set of mechanisms that we need to see come to play, whether it's to do with bank flows, whether it's to do with seizure of assets, whether it's to do with visa denials for people who steal the assets of their country and so on. So I just want to put all of this into context. So where are we with, we're extremely pleased with the progress that's come out of the Commission in the last few months. And it is really incredible to see the Commission take this leap forward from where the Dodd-Frank provision came in. I say that because our campaign work on revenue transparency around oil, particularly at the beginning, which has extended onto the obvious other area, mining, started in December 1999. And by 2002, we launched the Publish What You Pay campaign, which was the first global call for a mandatory mechanism to disclose revenue streams coming in from the extractive sector. That was rapidly followed by Prime Minister Blair, the then Prime Minister of the UK, launching what's now called the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which we'll talk more about as we progress in the discussion, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative. It requires governments to come to the table and say, we will participate. And the price of participation is that we will disclose what we get from all the participating companies. And at the point when a government says we will do it, then it is mandatory for the companies operating in that country to do likewise. And then there's a reconciliation process by an independent body. And the whole point of the ITI is that civil society is part of the whole process. And again, it's not just an audit process. Civil society is involved at varying stages in the process of holding government accountable. That's the principles behind EITI, which we fully support. The problem with EITI is that despite its existence now since late 2002, we are not waiting any time soon to see the likes of Obiang, who was in fact taking part in EITI, but I would describe fairly, I think, as a freeloader, or President Obiang, or any of half a dozen other characters like that we could name. So what do we do in the countries for which we had the greatest concern, which was the whole origin of this work in the first place? And the answer is we have no other source of this transparency other than mandatory mechanisms. And that's why we fully support what's happened through the Dodd-Frank provision in the United States and what's coming out of Europe now. And we would encourage the Parliament here to take this provision coming out of the Commission and work with it, because I think we're actually on the verge of potentially creating a global standard. We've seen, for example, the Hong Kong Exchange require disclosure on a country-by-country basis for new listers, and they've intimated to us that they would return and revisit for existing listers and amend and expand the coverage of that legislation should Europe and should the United States progress as they've been indicating. In addition, we've had similar messages from the Shanghai Exchange. So I think we're on the cusp of creating something here that could make a massive difference for a very relatively low cost for people in these countries, and it's vitally needed and it's urgent. And I'll stop with that. We can come back to some of the specifics as we go through the discussion.
Okay. Mr. Bütikofer, there was a strong appeal to the European Parliament to really make as much of this initiative as possible. Are you going to live up to your responsibilities?
I figure, Simon, that you will find few bodies in this city that are more sympathetic to the issue than the majority of the European Parliament would be. And in fact, that has been expressed already quite clearly because the Parliament voted in favor of supporting the similar legislation similar to the Carden-Luger amendment of the Dodd-Frank Act in the context of the raw materials report, which I drafted. So I think Parliament would be ready to follow up on that. I recall, though, that when I was still in an early phase of working on the topic, I ran across lobbyists with U.S. background who implored me to stay away from the whole very difficult and contentious Dodd-Frank and particularly Carden-Luger kind of business. Europe should be above that and know better. And I got interested in who these people were and why they were so excited about a topic I, at that point, knew little about. So they really aroused my interest. And I started inquiring about that, and I found they really had good reason for making such statements. Now, I'm happy that it's not only the European Parliament, but also the European Commission that is moving forward with legislation here. However, my praise for the proposal is not completely unqualified because, on one hand, it goes beyond Carden-Luger by, for instance, including forestry and some major non-listed companies. Some of my colleagues feel that it could have included agriculture, maybe. On the other hand, I think we should own up to the fact that it falls behind Carden-Luger when it proposes to make exemptions for the theoretical case that there would be national legislation considering such disclosure as criminal acts. I haven't studied that in detail myself, but I know that there is a study that has been published by people from Columbia University that have argued so far there is not a single case of such legislation that could be named. And of course, you start asking yourself, well, if that be the case, and maybe someone knows better and gives examples, but if that be the case really, why would we then go in that direction and sort of, it almost sounds as if someone wants to ring an alarm with some of the people that might yet introduce legislation. I mean, I really don't get the point there. Maybe that can be explained. And of course, then, the precise profile of this legislation will be decided only through the delegated acts. And of course, it remains to be seen then what the final profile would be. Presently, there are still important discussions going on as to the disclosure threshold, the definition of what a project is. The Publish What You Pay initiative has criticized the presently employed definition. And of course, there's also the issue, and I think it should also be taken into account of how we sort of coordinate meeting U.S. standards, meeting possible European standards and stuff like that. What I don't agree with is the statement that we should try, that's what I jotted down, to strike a balance between transparency and the burden that we put to companies. For me, this is a moral issue. This is about breaking the resource curse. And I think we should go to some length to really accomplish that. And companies that may be complaining that it would indeed create some additional burden, I'm not questioning that, should take a more long-range view. And Simon already mentioned what's been happening in Hong Kong at the exchange there. I think this is a broader tendency, and for Europeans as well as Americans to move ahead of the curve should be viewed as an opportunity and not as a burden. So I think that we can improve on the proposal as it stands presently, and clearly the European Parliament will be all in favor of passing strong legislation there.